I am Stella, 33 years old, and a forensic accountant. Every year, my family managed to conveniently forget my birthday while throwing lavish events for my brother. This year, standing in the freezing rain on their porch, I realized they had not just forgotten me, they were funding a massive party using my name. So I took my corporate bonus, bought a $1.2 million lake house in cash, and posted a single photo with the caption, "Birthday gift to myself." Their outrage was immediate. Their downfall was spectacular. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use your own success to tear down arrogant family members. The freezing rain soaked right through my wool coat as I stood on the porch of my childhood home in an upscale Connecticut suburb. It was exactly 8 in the evening on a Tuesday, the exact night of my 33rd birthday. In my freezing, trembling hands, I balanced a small single slice of red velvet cake I had bought for myself at a bakery downtown. My phone buzzed in my pocket, vibrating against my damp jeans with a text from my mother, Catherine. "Get here now," the text read. "We have a special surprise waiting for you." A foolish, childish part of me had actually believed her. Despite decades of evidence to the contrary, I had hoped that this year, just this once, they had remembered. I shivered violently, shifting the small cake box to one hand so I could slide my old brass key into the front door lock. It refused to turn. I pulled it out, wiped the rain from my eyes, and tried again, pushing my shoulder against the heavy oak door. Nothing. The deadbolt held firm. They had changed the locks again without telling me. Through the sprawling bay windows of our colonial house, warm golden light spilled out onto the flooded manicured lawn. I stepped to the side, peering through the rain-streaked glass, trying to understand what kind of special surprise required, locking me out in a torrential downpour. What I saw made the breath completely catch in my throat, replacing the cold air in my lungs with a sharp, familiar burn of rejection. The expansive living room had been completely transformed. Dozens of white linen tables dotted the floor. Professional caterers in crisp black vests wove expertly through a massive crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. A live jazz band played softly in the far corner, creating an atmosphere of absolute luxury. There were at least 100 guests laughing, mingling, and clinking crystal glasses. And right in the center of it all was my younger brother, Harrison. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, flashing his signature bright smile and raising a glass to a cheering crowd. Banners draped across the high ceiling read Harrison's Big 30 kickoff. This was not a surprise birthday party for me. This celebration had absolutely nothing to do with me. This was a kickoff event for Harrison's 30th birthday week. A bitter, heavy knot tightened in my stomach as I stood in the storm. This was the exact dynamic I had grown up with, the unspoken but ironclad rule of our household. Harrison was the golden child, the visionary entrepreneur who deserved every available resource, every drop of parental attention, and every dollar my parents could scrape together. I was just Stella, the workhorse, the reliable, invisible daughter expected to stay out of the way. The contrast between our lives was staggering. When I turned 18, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and formally announced that they could not afford my college tuition. They claimed times were tough, but less than a month later, they handed Harrison $50,000 as capital for a tech startup he was launching. That startup failed in less than 6 months. I worked 3 grueling jobs, waitressing, bookkeeping, and tutoring just to pay my way through a demanding accounting degree. I studied until my eyes blurred, eating cheap noodles and living in cramped apartments with 3 roommates. I built my career as a forensic accountant, from the very ground up, tracing financial fraud and corporate money laundering, relying on absolutely no one but myself. I clawed my way into a highly respected firm, earning every promotion through sheer grit and intelligence. Meanwhile, Harrison received a brand new Porsche for his high school graduation and endless unchecked streams of seed money for various businesses that never materialized. How was a serial startup CEO who had never actually generated a single dollar of profit, yet my parents treated him like the next great innovator of our generation. My hands were completely numb from the cold, and the cardboard cake box was turning soggy and collapsing in the relentless rain. I finally pressed the doorbell, holding my freezing finger against the button, until the loud chimes finally cut through the muffled music and laughter inside. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy front door swung open, splashing a puddle of icy water against my boots. My mother, Catherine, stood in the doorway. She wore an expensive emerald green evening gown, her hair perfectly styled in an elegant updo, holding a half-empty crystal champagne flute. She looked me up and down, her eyes tracking over my dripping coat, my soaked hair, and the pathetic crushed cake box in my hands. Her expression did not hold a single ounce of maternal warmth, sympathy, or guilt. Instead, she looked profoundly annoyed. "You are late?" Catherine snapped, completely ignoring the fact that I was shivering and locked out of the home I had grown up in. "Get inside through the mudroom. You are dripping water everywhere and ruining the aesthetic of the entryway." I stepped inside slowly, my wet boots squeaking loudly against the pristine hardwood floors. "Mom," I asked, my voice tight and strained, "you changed the locks. And what exactly is all this? You texted me that you had a surprise for me today." She rolled her eyes, waving her manicured hand, impatiently motioning for me to hurry up and move out of sight. "The surprise is that we are launching Harrison's birthday week early. The caterers are completely swamped and I need you to make yourself useful. Go to the kitchen and grab a towel. You need to wipe up those puddles you just made before one of Harrison's important investors slips." I stood there, frozen, the icy water from my coat pooling around my feet, realizing that my 33rd birthday meant absolutely nothing to her. She had not invited me here to celebrate my life. She had lured me here to work as unpaid staff at my brother's lavish party. The cruelty was so casual, so deeply ingrained in her behavior, that she did not even register the insult. I slowly set my soggy cake box down on the antique entryway console, the sweet icing smearing against the damp cardboard. This was the moment the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty completely snapped. Catherine did not even look at the cake box. She grabbed me by the sleeve of my wet coat, her manicured nails digging sharply into my arm, and yanked me away from the grand foyer. She dragged me down the narrow hallway toward the service kitchen, pushing me through the swinging doors, where the noise of the party suddenly vanished into the frantic clattering of hired staff. The industrial stainless steel countertops were covered in half-empty trays of expensive appetizers and empty bottles of imported champagne. Before I could even shake the cold water from my hair, Catherine reached into the corner and shoved a heavy, damp mop directly against my chest. I stumbled back, catching the wooden handle awkwardly. Then she slapped a thick stack of printed papers right on top of my wet hands. I looked down. They were invoices, high-end catering bills, floral arrangement receipts, and equipment rental contracts. "Wipe down the staff entrance before someone slips," Catherine commanded, her voice dropping to an urgent, harsh whisper. "And then look at those invoices. The main catering company is threatening to pull their servers if we do not settle the remaining balance by 10 o'clock tonight. It is $15,000. I need you to handle it, Stella. Use those fancy accountant skills of yours and just get it paid. Your brother cannot be stressed with financial trivialities on his big night." I stared at the bold black ink on the top invoice. $15,000. For a party celebrating a man who had never held down a real job. "You want me to pay $15,000 for Harrison's birthday party right now?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "It is actually my birthday today too, Mom. You did not even say happy birthday." Catherine scoffed, adjusting a diamond earring that I knew she had purchased on credit. "Do not be so selfish, Stella. You are a single woman with no real responsibilities. Harrison is building an empire. He needs to impress these investors tonight. Consider this your investment in his future. Just put it on one of your credit cards. You make good money tracking down missing pennies for those soulless corporations, do you not? It is time you actually contributed to this family instead of hoarding your wealth." I opened my mouth to reply, to point out the absolute insanity of demanding. I fund my brother's ego trip on the night of my own ignored birthday. But the kitchen doors swung open again, interrupting me. Naomi walked in. Harrison's wife, Naomi, moved with the exaggerated, practiced grace of someone who desperately wanted to appear wealthy. She was a beautiful African-American woman, tall and striking, but her entire personality was built on a hollow illusion of luxury. Tonight she was wearing a breathtaking floor-length emerald silk gown with distinctive asymmetrical draping across the shoulder. The breath left my lungs for the second time that night. I knew that dress. I knew every intricate stitch, every fold of that fabric, and the exact retail price of $3,000. I knew it because I was the one who had bought it. I had purchased that exact gown to wear to an upcoming corporate awards gala. A month ago, the tracking notification said it was delivered to my porch, but when I got home, the package was mysteriously missing. Naomi had visited my apartment complex that very afternoon, claiming she wanted to drop off a recipe card. She had stolen it right off my doorstep. Naomi glided over to the stainless steel island, pouring herself another glass of expensive champagne. She did not even flinch when she saw me staring at the dress. "Stella. Thank goodness you are here," Naomi said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness and unmistakable condescension. "The servers are moving too slowly with the caviar blinis. I need you to go out there and manage them. Make sure they do not ruin our big night. Harrison is about to pitch his new app to a venture capitalist, and the ambience needs to be absolutely flawless." She took a sip of her champagne, looking me up and down with obvious distaste. "And please," she added, wrinkling her nose, "take off that soaked coat before you go out there. You look like a wet stray dog. We cannot have Harrison's investors thinking we associate with people who cannot afford an umbrella." I looked at Naomi standing there in my stolen $3,000 dress, sipping champagne that my mother was currently demanding I pay for, while celebrating my brother's fake success on the exact night of my actual birthday. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of these people was not just insulting anymore, it was pathological. They truly believed I existed solely to be drained, to serve as an endless financial and emotional resource for their delusions of grandeur. A normal person might have started screaming. A normal person might have grabbed the champagne glass and thrown it, or demanded the dress back right then and there. But I was not just a normal person. I was a forensic accountant. I spent my days meticulously dismantling highly organized criminal enterprises by quietly tracking and following the illicit money. I knew that screaming gave away your power. I knew that anger was an undisciplined emotion that alerted your enemies to your next move. I looked down at the mop handle in my right hand and the stack of $15,000 invoices in my left. I did not yell. I did not demand my dress back. I did not even mention my birthday again. I let a slow, cold smile form on my lips. The kind of smile I used right before I handed a devastating audit report to a federal prosecutor. "Sure, Naomi," I said, my voice entirely smooth and utterly devoid of any visible emotion. "I will absolutely take care of everything for you right now. Starting with these catering invoices." I let the heavy wet mop slip from my fingers. It hit the tile floor with a loud wet smack that echoed sharply over the clattering of the kitchen staff. Then I lifted my left hand and let the thick stack of catering invoices flutter to the ground, scattering across the puddles I had just been ordered to clean. The polite smile vanished from my face. "I will take care of it by telling you to pay your own bills," I said, my tone as hard and unyielding as concrete. "I am not funding this delusion, and I am certainly not paying a single cent for a party I was not even invited to." Catherine gasped, clutching her pearls in a gesture so dramatic it belonged in a soap opera. Naomi actually took a step back, her champagne sloshing over the rim of her glass and staining the silk of my stolen dress. "You ungrateful brat," Catherine hissed, her voice rising above the kitchen noise. "How dare you speak to us this way after everything we have done for you? Get your credit card out right now before you ruin your brother's night." I turned on my heel and pushed back through the swinging doors, walking out of the service kitchen and into the main hallway. I was done. I wanted to walk straight out the front door and never look back. But Catherine followed hot on my heels, her designer shoes clicking frantically against the hardwood. She grabbed my shoulder, trying to physically spin me around. "You are not walking away from me, Stella," she spat, her face flushing an angry crimson. "We need that $15,000. You have it sitting in your bank account doing absolutely nothing." I shrugged her hand off my shoulder with a sharp jerk. "It is my money, Catherine. Earned by me. Not a communal fund for Harrison's ego," I replied. "What is going on out here?" a deep, booming voice demanded. My father, Thomas, marched down the hallway. He was a tall, imposing man who carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a self-made billionaire despite currently drowning in country club debt. He wore a velvet smoking jacket and held a tumbler of amber liquid glaring at me as if I were a trespasser who had just tracked mud across his pristine life. Thomas Catherine whined immediately, playing the victim. She is refusing to help her brother. The caterers are demanding payment and she just threw the invoices on the floor. She is trying to sabotage Harrison. Thomas stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking my path to the front door. He cornered me against the expensive floral wallpaper towering over me to use his physical size as an intimidation tactic. He had done this since I was a teenager, using his physical presence to force compliance. "I should have known you would pull a stunt like this today." Thomas snarled, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon. "You just cannot stand to see anyone else happy, can you? You are 33 years old, Stella. Look at yourself. You are bitter. You are entirely alone and you are dripping wet in the hallway while your younger brother is out there building an empire." I stared back at him, refusing to shrink against the wall. "Harrison is building a house of cards." "Cards," I corrected coldly. "And you are expecting me to buy the glue." Thomas slammed his hand flat against the wall right next to my head, causing a framed photograph of Harrison to rattle on its hook. "Shut your mouth," he barked. "You are just intensely jealous. You are jealous of his success. You are jealous of his beautiful wife. You are furious because Harrison found a gorgeous, supportive woman like Naomi, while you cannot even get a man to look at you twice. You work 80-hour weeks crunching numbers in a cubicle because you have absolutely nothing else in your pathetic life." His words were designed to completely break me, to hit every societal insecurity a woman in her 30s was supposed to harbor. But I felt absolutely nothing. No sting, no shame, just a clinical observation of his desperation. "This family operates as a single unit," Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a menacing authoritarian growl. "We support each other. Harrison has the vision. He has the charisma to generate generational wealth for all of us. But a vision requires capital. Since you have failed to start a family of your own, since you have no husband to support, and no children to feed, your income belongs to this family's future. Your money is the resource that fuels Harrison's potential. That is your role here. You will pay that catering invoice tonight, and you will apologize to your mother and your sister-in-law for your unacceptable attitude." The sheer, unfiltered audacity of his ultimatum hung in the air. He was not asking for a favor. He was claiming ownership of my life, my labor, and my financial independence simply because I was an unmarried woman who had the misfortune of sharing his last name. He truly believed I was merely a battery meant to be drained to power his favorite child. I looked my father dead in the eye, my gaze absolutely unwavering. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. "I am not a bank, and I am no longer your punching bag. You want to throw a $100,000 party? Figure out how to pay for it yourselves." The veins in Thomas's neck bulged against his stiff white collar. His face contorted with a sudden violent rage. "You arrogant, useless failure," he roared. Before I could brace myself, he grabbed the lapels of my soaked wool coat with both hands. He jerked me forward and then shoved me violently backward down the hallway. I stumbled, my wet boots losing traction on the polished wood. He marched after me, shoving me again, driving me aggressively toward the heavy oak front door. I put my hands up to defend myself, but his momentum was relentless. "Get out of my house!" he screamed, grabbing the brass handle and ripping the door open to the howling storm outside. "Do not ever show your face here again until you are ready to grovel for our forgiveness. You are dead to us." With one final brutal push, he threw me over the threshold. I flew backward, my boots catching the edge of the stone steps, and I fell hard onto the freezing rain-slicked porch, scraping my palms against the rough masonry. Behind me, the heavy oak door slammed shut with a deafening crack, followed immediately by the sharp metallic snap of the deadbolt sliding into place. I lay there on the cold stone for a long moment, the torrential rain instantly soaking through my clothes again, washing away the warmth of the hallway. The icy water plastered my hair to my face and stung the scrapes on my hands. I pushed myself up slowly, brushing the debris from my bleeding palms. A normal daughter might have broken down right there on the steps. A normal person might have pounded on the door, sobbing, begging for a family that never truly existed to finally show her some mercy. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel the crushing weight of heartbreak or the paralyzing grip of rejection. Standing alone in the dark, freezing storm, the emotional, vulnerable part of my brain completely shut down. The messy, painful human feelings froze over, hardening into something sharp, impenetrable, and highly efficient. The wounded daughter was gone. The forensic accountant took over. I looked at the glowing windows of the house, watching the silhouettes of my family drinking champagne bought on credit, living in a fantasy funded by fraud. They wanted to play a game of numbers. They wanted to treat me as a financial asset to be leveraged and drained. They had no idea that they had just declared war on a woman who dismantled fraudulent empires for a living. I turned my back on the house, walking methodically to my car, my mind already calculating the exact legal and financial steps required to completely obliterate their world. I drove back to my quiet, modest apartment in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio or the heater. The only sound was the rhythmic, heavy thud of the windshield wipers, aggressively clearing the torrential rain from the glass. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel with absolute stillness. The physical cold from the winter storm had seeped deeply into my bones, but my mind was operating at a blistering, calculating speed. I pulled into my designated parking spot, turned off the ignition, and walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my unit. My apartment was the exact antithesis of my parents' sprawling colonial mansion. It was compact, meticulously organized, and furnished with high-quality items I had purchased outright. There was no leased luxury here, only genuine hard-earned ownership. I locked the deadbolt behind me, stripped off my ruined, soaked wool coat, and left my muddy boots on the entry mat. I did not bother with the hot shower to chase away the chill. I dried my hair roughly with a towel pulled on a thick wool sweater and walked straight into my home office. I sat down at my large glass desk, booted up my primary dual-monitor workstation, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to look at the numbers. The fundamental rule of forensic accounting is that money always leaves a trail. Wealth cannot be manifested out of thin air, and massive sums of cash cannot disappear without leaving an echoing footprint in the financial system. As I stared at the glowing monitors, the underlying math of tonight's confrontation absolutely refused to align. The $15,000 catering invoice Catherine had shoved into my chest was merely a symptom of a much larger malignant disease. My parents were throwing a week-long $100,000 extravaganza for Harrison. That level of reckless spending required deep, accessible liquidity. But Thomas and Catherine did not have liquidity. I knew their financial habits intimately because I had spent my early 20s begging them to adhere to a basic budget. They were currently drowning in overdue country club membership fees, maintaining expensive luxury vehicle leases they could barely afford, and bleeding cash into a portfolio of terrible stock investments Thomas had made on a misguided whim. Their net worth was entirely tied up in illiquid assets, inflated property values, and vanity projects designed to impress their equally leveraged friends. They lived paycheck to paycheck on a massive, terrifying scale, relying on a delicate balancing act of minimum credit card payments and shifting debt. The equation was glaringly wrong. A family struggling to keep up suburban appearances does not suddenly drop 6 figures on a birthday party, let alone hand over blank checks to an unemployed son and his perpetually shopping wife. I opened my secure browser and logged into my professional encrypted databases. As a certified senior forensic accountant, I had legal authorized access to comprehensive public property records, municipal county clerk filings, and advanced credit inquiry tools used for corporate investigations. I was not hacking into their personal bank accounts because I did not need to. People who severely mismanage money are notoriously sloppy, leaving massive public footprints for anyone who knows exactly where to look. I started with the surface-level data, pulling up the municipal tax records for their Beacon Hill property. The screen refreshed instantly, displaying a wall of sterile black and white text. I scrolled past the original purchase date from decades ago, scanning the historical liens, municipal tax assessments, and recorded property titles. Everything looked relatively normal until I adjusted the search parameters to isolate financial activity within the last 6 months. A new document materialized on the screen, a recent municipal filing that made my eyes narrow sharply as I read the detailed abstract. Before diving completely into that specific property anomaly, I opened a second monitor display and ran a permissible background business credit check on Harrison's newly registered corporate entity. This was the shell company he loudly claimed was going to revolutionize the tech world. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds before the financial dashboard populated. The results were a chaotic, bleeding red landscape of massive recent expenditures. I tracked the digital ledgers, following the money as it hemorrhaged from his primary business accounts into highly suspicious, completely non-business related channels. There were thousands of dollars funneled directly to the high-end catering company managing tonight's gala. There were 5-figure luxury vehicle rental deposits. There was even a highly specific $3,000 charge at a boutique designer store in New York, processed exactly 1 month ago. That was the exact retail price of the emerald silk dress Naomi had worn while mocking my wet coat in the kitchen. The money trail painted a crystal-clear picture of absolute financial recklessness and misappropriation of funds. Harrison was not operating a legitimate technology business. He was running a personal slush fund to sustain his and Naomi's fabricated elite lifestyle. My fingers flew across the keyboard executing advanced query protocols I usually reserved for dismantling multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement rings. I tracked the vendor identification numbers from the catering invoices. I pulled the public commercial transaction histories. The money was flowing like a busted fire hydrant. Custom ice sculptures, imported truffles, a live band hired and flown in from out of state. The sheer volume of cash being actively burned for a fake milestone was staggering to witness. But the core terrifying question remained completely unanswered on my screens. Where did the initial capital come from? Harrison absolutely could not secure a traditional commercial loan. His credit score was a smoking crater from his previous failed ventures. He had defaulted on 2 luxury cars and a commercial office lease before he even turned 28. No legitimate regulated bank would ever hand him $250,000 without an ironclad, heavily vetted guarantee. Furthermore, Thomas and Catherine severely lacked the verifiable liquid income to act as credible co-signers for a business loan of that massive magnitude. Their debt-to-income ratio would immediately trigger a rejection from any automated underwriting system. I leaned closer to the monitor, the cool blue light reflecting in my eyes, as the adrenaline of the hunt began to override my physical exhaustion. I pulled up the commercial loan registries, searching for uniform commercial code filings under Harrison's name and his new corporate entity. A fresh UCC financing statement popped up on the database dated exactly 4 months ago. It was a massive high-risk commercial loan originated by a notoriously predatory secondary lending institution. I clicked on the attached public collateral documents, my heart beating with a slow, heavy, measured rhythm in my chest. I was looking for the guarantor. Someone with a flawless credit history, 0 missed payments, and a substantial verifiable income had to be on the hook for this debt. The predatory lender would never have released $250,000 into Harrison's reckless hands without a perfect legally binding signature from a highly qualified individual. I held my breath, moving the mouse cursor over the final digital PDF attachment that contained the primary loan origination signatures. I clicked the file. The high-resolution scan loaded line by line, rendering the stark black text against the bright white background of my monitor. I scrolled past the predatory interest rates, the draconian repayment terms, and the brutal default clauses that characterize this specific type of high-risk secondary lending. I scrolled down to the very bottom of the final page right below Harrison's sloppy, arrogant signature. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to absolute ice in my veins. There, printed in crisp ink, was my full legal name. Right beside it was a signature that looked exactly like mine. I leaned closer until my nose almost touched the monitor glass, analyzing the strokes, the pressure points, and the loops. It was a nearly perfect recreation of my signature, but I had never signed this document. I had never even seen this contract in my life. How? The single word echoed in my mind as my brain raced through the legal impossibilities. To secure a commercial loan of $250,000, a simple digital signature was completely insufficient. There had to be a licensed notary physical identification or a legally binding proxy. The bank would require an airtight guarantee before releasing that kind of capital. I quickly flipped to the supplementary documents attached to the digital loan file, my eyes scanning the index of uploaded records. There it was, a scanned copy of a general power of attorney. I recognized the specific legal formatting of the document immediately, and a sudden violent wave of nausea washed over me. 12 years ago, during my sophomore year of college, I had been hospitalized with a severe life-threatening bout of pneumonia. I was unconscious for 3 days, hooked up to a ventilator. When I finally woke up weak and disoriented, Thomas and Catherine sat by my hospital bed playing the role of deeply concerned parents. They convinced me to sign a power of attorney so they could handle my mounting medical bills, speak to the insurance companies on my behalf, and manage my tiny checking account while I recovered. The document was supposed to be formally destroyed the moment I was discharged and healthy. Instead, my parents had kept it. They had deliberately hidden it in their files for over a decade, keeping it like a loaded weapon waiting for the perfect moment to be fired. But a 12-year-old medical proxy would immediately raise severe red flags at any modern lending institution. A bank underwriter would question why a 33-year-old successful accountant was using a proxy from her college days to co-sign a loan for her brother. I scrutinized the notary stamp and the execution date on the document submitted to the bank. It had been completely altered. They had meticulously doctored the dates, likely using a forged notary seal or bribing a corrupt official to make the power of attorney look recent and entirely valid. They had walked into that predatory lending office, presented my pristine credit score, handed over my altered legal proxy, and signed my financial life away without a second thought. They legally bound me as the primary guarantor for $250,000 of toxic debt. The chaotic pieces of the puzzle were now violently slamming into place. The $250,000 covered the massive commercial loan, but the math on my primary monitor still showed a minor liquidity gap. The high-end catering, the luxury cars, the constant flow of expensive champagne, it required more immediate liquid cash to keep the illusion afloat before the loan funds were fully dispersed. I switched my attention back to the municipal property records I had pulled earlier, the ones showing the glaring anomaly on their Beacon Hill home. I opened the detailed property abstract. It was a second mortgage. Thomas and Catherine had quietly stripped every single ounce of remaining equity out of their house just 3 months ago. They had leveraged the very roof over their heads to the absolute legal limit, cashing out whatever value the aging property still held. They had taken that cash, combined it with the fraudulent $250,000 business loan secured by my stolen identity, and handed every single penny directly over to Harrison. I sat back in my ergonomic desk chair, the ambient hum of my computer servers sounding deafening in the dead silence of my apartment. The sheer magnitude of what I was looking at defied basic human comprehension. This was no longer just a family disagreement about paying for a party. This was not simply a toxic dynamic featuring a golden child and a scapegoat. This was a highly calculated, premeditated federal crime. My own flesh and blood had committed identity theft, wire fraud, and bank fraud. They had deliberately and coldly engineered my total financial ruin to fund an absolute fantasy. If Harrison's fake company went under, which it inevitably would, because he had no actual product, the bank would not go after him. They would not go after my parents, who were now essentially bankrupt, holding a heavily leveraged house and zero liquid assets. The bank would come directly for me. They would aggressively garnish my wages, seize my bank accounts, and completely destroy my flawless credit rating. My career as a forensic accountant required maintaining absolute financial integrity and passing rigorous annual federal background checks. A default on a massive commercial loan would trigger an immediate, irreversible termination from my firm. They were not just stealing my money. They were actively destroying my livelihood, my hard-earned professional reputation, and my entire future. The absolute ruthlessness of their actions was breathtaking. Thomas had shoved me out into the freezing rain tonight, calling me a bitter, useless failure, demanding I pay a caterer to protect the family unit. He had stood there in his velvet smoking jacket, dripping with righteous indignation, knowing full well he had already forged my signature to steal $250,000 in my name. Catherine had shrieked at me for ruining her visual aesthetic, fully aware she had mortgaged her own home and sold her daughter into financial slavery just to fund Naomi's designer wardrobe and Harrison's fragile ego. I closed my eyes and took one long, deep breath. The anger inside me crystallized into something far more dangerous than rage. It became pure, unadulterated focus. A normal person would call the police immediately. A normal person would panic, hire a defense lawyer, and start screaming about injustice. I did none of those things. I was a professional investigator. I needed to see exactly how close this financial bomb was to detonating before I decided exactly how to defuse it. I needed to know the current status of Harrison's loan. I shifted my mouse, opening a new tab to bypass the public registry and access the secure banking communications portal. The secure banking portal required an authorized point of contact to release specific account standings. The loan documentation I just reviewed listed a primary email address for the guarantor. It was not my current professional email. It was an ancient, long-forgotten webmail account I had created during my freshman year of college, the exact same email address printed on that outdated forged power of attorney. I had abandoned that inbox a decade ago, but the security questions were set when I was 18. Mother's maiden name, first pet. I bypassed the password prompt in less than 30 seconds. The inbox loaded slowly, completely choked with thousands of unread spam messages, but I immediately filtered the sender by the name of the predatory lending institution. A wall of high-priority red-flagged messages flooded the top of my screen. They had been emailing me for 90 days. The subject lines in the inbox told a horrifying chronological story of escalating panic. It started with polite payment reminders, transitioned into urgent account reviews, and finally escalated to aggressive red-flagged legal threats. I clicked on the most recent email dispatched exactly 48 hours ago. It was a formal notice of default, complete with attached legal summons documents. My eyes scanned the brutal, unapologetic legal language. Harrison had not just missed a single payment. He had never made one. Since the $250,000 was disbursed into his shell company account 4 months ago, he had completely ignored the repayment schedule. He had not even paid the interest. The grace period was officially and permanently over. The penalty fees had already compounded, adding thousands of dollars to the principal balance. The lender was formally announcing their intent to initiate immediate asset seizure, aggressive wage garnishment, and a lien against any real property owned by the primary guarantor, against me. The timing of this default notice hit me with the force of a physical blow. 48 hours ago, the bank officially warned they were coming for my money. Tonight, my parents were throwing a $100,000 party for Harrison. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, looking at the ceiling of my quiet apartment as the sickening reality of the situation finally snapped into absolute clarity. The extravagant 30th birthday gala was not merely a grotesque celebration of Harrison's inflated ego, it was an incredibly desperate, highly orchestrated trap. Harrison was entirely out of stolen cash. The predatory loan was gone, completely burned up in just 4 months. He had squandered it on luxury vehicle leases, designer wardrobes for Naomi, expensive dinners to maintain appearances, and completely useless vanity investments. He had absolutely no actual technology product, no tangible revenue stream, and zero genuine business prospects. His entire company was just a registered name on a piece of paper. The party tonight was not a celebration. It was a high-stakes smoke and mirrors networking event designed exclusively to lure in naive, wealthy venture capitalists and gullible country club acquaintances. Naomi's desperate command in the kitchen suddenly echoed loudly in my mind. She had explicitly stated that Harrison was pitching his new app to an investor, and the ambiance needed to be absolutely flawless. They were attempting to secure new legitimate investment capital under completely fraudulent pretenses. They needed to cover the massive gaping financial hole left by the stolen defaulted loan. It was a textbook desperate Ponzi scheme. They needed new money to pay off the old debt, or at least to sustain the illusion, just long enough to secure another fraudulent line of credit from a different victim. If Harrison failed to hook a rich investor tonight, the entire fragile house of cards would instantly collapse. The catering company would sue for the $15,000 balance. The predatory lender would immediately file the paperwork to execute the default judgment. Because my parents had secretly mortgaged their home to the absolute limit, they were completely judgment-proof. They had no equity and no cash. The bank would bypass them entirely and come straight for my bank accounts, my retirement fund, and my professional license. The sheer terrifying elegance of their betrayal was staggering. My family had not simply been negligent or financially irresponsible. They had meticulously engineered my total financial execution. I thought about Naomi standing in the service kitchen wearing the $3,000 emerald silk dress she had physically stolen from my porch. She had sipped expensive champagne and sneered at my wet coat, fully believing she had secured her place in the upper echelon of society. She genuinely thought she was better than me, completely oblivious to the fact that every single thread on her body, every drop of wine in her glass, and the very roof over her head were entirely funded by my stolen identity. My parents had sacrificed my entire life, my career, and my independence, just to ensure Naomi could play a wealthy socialite and Harrison could pretend to be a successful, innovative tech entrepreneur. The forensic accountant inside me fully detached from any lingering pathetic sense of familial loyalty. Blood did not mean anything when it was actively trying to drain you dry. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial deception. They wanted to use my name, my immaculate credit history, and my hard-earned stability as disposable poker chips in their desperate illegal gamble. But Thomas, Catherine, and Harrison had made one massive, absolutely fatal miscalculation when they decided to forge my signature. They had completely forgotten exactly what I did for a living. I spent 40 to 60 hours a week hunting down white-collar criminals. I did not just read numbers, I weaponized them. I tracked hidden offshore accounts, unraveled complex embezzlement schemes, and handed airtight dossiers to federal prosecutors. I leaned forward, the cool blue glow of the dual monitors, casting long, sharp shadows across my quiet home office. I was not going to wait for the predatory bank to freeze my assets and destroy my life. I was not going to hire a defense attorney and play the pathetic victim in a messy, drawn-out civil court battle. I was going to systematically, ruthlessly dismantle their entire operation from the inside out. I was going to obliterate their fake empire, and I was going to do it tonight while they were busy drinking my stolen champagne. The first step in dismantling a fraudulent enterprise is ensuring you possess absolute leverage. I did not storm back to the mansion that night to cause a public scene. Confrontation without meticulous preparation is a tactical error that only gives the enemy precious time to hide their assets. Instead, I locked my home office door, brewed a pot of black coffee, and initiated a grueling, uninterrupted 48-hour deep dive into my family's financial network. The predatory bank had issued a 48-hour default warning. I would use that exact time frame to build an impenetrable digital fortress of evidence. Operating in pure cold silence, I deployed every advanced investigative software tool at my disposal. I ran a forensic tracing algorithm on the $250,000 loan disbursement. The massive sum had landed in Harrison's corporate account 4 months ago. From there, the ledgers revealed an absolute massacre of fiduciary responsibility. Harrison had not invested a single cent into software development or infrastructure. He had immediately initiated a series of massive wire transfers. I tracked the routing numbers, watching the stolen capital flow directly out of the business entity and straight into Naomi's personal checking accounts. The transaction histories were a staggering catalog of extreme vanity. I systematically logged the precise dates, vendor codes, and exact dollar amounts. There was $15,000 wired directly to a luxury travel agency for a vacation to St. Bart's. $20,000 lump sums were funneled to high-end jewelers and exclusive boutique retailers in Manhattan. It was not just the stolen emerald dress. Naomi was actively using the funds secured by my forged signature to finance daily designer shopping sprees, completely draining the stolen commercial capital to maintain her facade of extreme wealth. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic clacking the only sound in the apartment as the sun rose and set twice outside my window. I was no longer a daughter, reeling from a betrayal. I was a surgeon, meticulously sharpening a scalpel. I isolated the exact IP addresses used to digitally authorize the fraudulent loan documents matching the geolocation data directly to the private network at my parents' Beacon Hill estate. This definitively proved they had executed the forgery from their own living room. Next, I pulled their recent joint tax filings. Thomas and Catherine had grossly misrepresented their income and failed to declare the cash influx they had siphoned from their secret second mortgage, compounding their identity theft with blatant federal tax evasion. Every piece of damning data, every wire transfer receipt, and every fraudulent signature was categorized, heavily encrypted, and backed up to secure off-site servers. I built a comprehensive airtight dossier that a federal prosecutor could effortlessly use to secure multiple felony convictions. I did not shed a single tear over the weekend. I did not pause to mourn the toxic family I never had. By the time Monday morning arrived, the emotional wound had completely cauterized. I had successfully gathered the arsenal. My phone screen suddenly illuminated the dark room, casting a harsh white glare across my glass desk. A cheerful, upbeat chime pierced the absolute silence of my apartment. It was a notification from our family group chat. I picked up the device assuming it was going to be a frantic, angry message regarding the unpaid catering bills from the birthday party. Instead, the sheer audacity radiating from the screen was so intense it temporarily paralyzed me. Naomi had dropped a web link into the chat for a premium real estate listing. It was a breathtaking, sprawling lake house located in an incredibly exclusive Connecticut suburb, currently on the market for $1.2 million. Below, the glossy digital photographs of a private boat dock and a massive wrap-around porch. Naomi had typed a sickeningly enthusiastic message. "Harrison and I are finally buying our dream home," she wrote. "The housing market is super competitive right now, and we need to move fast. Stella, since your credit is so good, and you have no real living expenses, we need you to co-sign the mortgage application tomorrow morning. We are dropping the down payment this week. Do not be selfish and hold up the closing process. We are all counting on you." I stared blankly at the glowing text messages. The sheer pathological disconnect from reality was completely staggering. They had already stolen $250,000 using my forged signature. They had secretly drained every ounce of equity from my parents' house. They were currently actively defaulting on a highly illegal predatory commercial loan. And now, completely unbothered by the financial apocalypse they had secretly triggered, Naomi genuinely expected me to legally bind myself to over $1 million of new debt so she could casually play house on a private lake. Before I could even begin to process the absolute insanity of her demand, my father chimed into the group chat. Thomas sent a rapid-fire series of highly aggressive texts. "You need to do this for your brother right now, Stella. This luxury lake house is a vital networking asset for his new technology company. Do not let your petty jealousy ruin his future. This family operates as a single unit, and you urgently need to do your part." Catherine immediately followed up, her digital words dripping with heavy manipulative guilt. "If you refuse to help your family achieve this major milestone, after everything we have sacrificed for you, we will have absolutely no choice but to cut you out of our lives entirely. We will not tolerate a toxic, unsupportive presence in our inner circle. You will be completely on your own forever. Co-sign the real estate paperwork tomorrow morning, or do not ever bother calling us again." They were aggressively threatening to disown me if I did not instantly buy them $1 million mansion. I did not text back. I simply took a high-resolution screenshot of the entire threatening conversation, carefully uploaded the image file directly into my encrypted federal fraud dossier, and let out a short, cold laugh. The trap was finally set. I placed my phone face down on the cold glass surface of my desk, intentionally muting the endless barrage of desperate, threatening messages from the family group chat. The screen immediately lit up again, casting a sharp white glow against the darkened walls of my home office. I sighed heavily, fully expecting another unhinged, emotionally manipulative rant from Catherine about the absolute urgency of the lake house mortgage. But the notification banner flashing across the locked screen did not contain my mother's dramatic guilt trips or my father's aggressive ultimatums. It was an automated high-priority push alert from my primary financial institution. I picked the device back up, bypassed the biometric security lock, and opened the application. A highly secure direct deposit transaction had just successfully cleared my primary checking account. I stared at the heavily encrypted dashboard, my eyes carefully scanning the digital ledger. There, sitting at the very top of the transaction history in crisp, bold green numbers, was a newly processed wire transfer for exactly $800,000. It was not a glitch in the banking software. It was not a routing error. It was my annual performance bonus from the elite forensic accounting firm where I was employed as a senior investigator. 6 months ago, the senior partners had assigned me as the lead forensic auditor on a massive, highly sensitive federal task force. We were actively investigating a multinational corporate logistics company that had been systematically laundering millions of dollars through a complex web of offshore shell corporations and fake philanthropic charities. It was a brutal, grueling assignment. It required 4 consecutive months of working 80-hour weeks, analyzing tens of thousands of encrypted digital ledgers, and tracking microscopic discrepancies across international borders. I ultimately broke their heavily guarded financial network, handing the Department of Justice a completely airtight, meticulously documented dossier. That single investigation resulted in 5 federal indictments and the immediate recovery of over $40 million in stolen corporate assets. The massive $800,000 deposit I was looking at right now was my firm's standard contractual percentage cut of the recovered capital, awarded directly to the lead investigator who cracked the case. I tapped the touchscreen to view my consolidated portfolio balance. The massive new cash influx seamlessly merged with my existing aggressively managed assets. Unlike my parents, who recklessly spent every single dime they ever earned on luxury car leases and exorbitant country club memberships, just to maintain a fragile neighborhood illusion of wealth, I had spent my entire adult life practicing brutal, unyielding financial discipline. I intentionally lived in a modest, highly secure apartment. I drove a reliable 5-year-old sedan that I owned completely outright. I avoided consumer debt like a plague, and I invested my substantial baseline salary into heavily diversified high-yield index funds, municipal bonds, and secure real estate investment trusts. The banking application refreshed, calculating the final updated total of my liquid accounts. I was currently sitting on over $1.5 million in completely unrestricted, immediately accessible cash. I stared at the massive 7-figure number glowing quietly in the dark room, feeling the weight of that financial reality settle into my bones. The profound, almost suffocating irony of the situation was absolutely staggering. Less than 5 miles away, my family was currently drowning in a toxic, inescapable ocean of illegal debt. Thomas and Catherine had secretly drained every ounce of equity from their aging mansion, legally crippling themselves just to fund a fake tech company. Harrison and Naomi were actively dodging aggressive collection agents from a predatory lender, relying entirely on a desperate, highly illegal Ponzi scheme to keep their stolen luxury cars from being repossessed. They were completely broke, facing imminent federal fraud charges and fiercely demanding that I co-sign a $1 million mortgage because they literally could not afford to buy a gallon of milk without using stolen credit. And yet, despite their absolute financial ruin, they constantly treated me like a useless, bitter failure. They endlessly mocked my quiet lifestyle, my modest clothing, and my grueling work hours. Thomas had physically shoved me out into the freezing rain, screaming that I was intensely jealous of Harrison's completely fabricated success. Catherine had coldly threatened to completely disown me and cut me out of the family if I did not instantly sacrifice my financial stability to buy Naomi a luxurious lakeside playground. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than a desperate, lonely woman who existed solely to serve as their financial safety net and emotional punching bag. They had absolutely no idea that I could legally purchase their precious, heavily leveraged Beacon Hill estate right now, completely in cash, and still have enough money left over to comfortably retire before I turned 35. They had absolutely no concept of the quiet, immense wealth I had meticulously built while they were busy destroying their own lives for the sake of temporary suburban appearances. I walked over to the tall office window, Looking out over the rain-swept streets of the sleeping city, the winter storm was finally beginning to break the heavy dark clouds, parting to reveal the faint cold glow of the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The intense anger that had been simmering in my chest for the past 48 hours completely evaporated, replaced instantly by a deep, absolute, and chilling sense of calm. Money is not just basic currency. In the right hands, massive liquid wealth is raw, unadulterated power. It is the tactical ability to completely dictate the terms of reality. My family had arrogantly tried to use my pristine credit as a blunt weapon against me, forging my signature to lock me into their sinking ship. But they had severely underestimated their opponent. I was not going to simply report their blatant identity theft to the local authorities and let the slow, highly bureaucratic justice system handle it. That was entirely too easy. That would allow them to aggressively play the victims, to spin a pathetic narrative to their country club friends about a vindictive, jealous daughter ruining their lives over a simple financial misunderstanding. I was going to use my massive capital to engineer a highly specific, completely inescapable financial trap. I was going to let them walk right into it, completely blind to the reality of who actually held the absolute power. I turned back to my glass desk, closed the banking application, and opened a new encrypted browser window. The ultimate counterstrike was about to begin. I did not sleep a single second that night. By 7 o'clock the following morning, the violent winter storm had finally passed, leaving behind a cold, blindingly bright sky. I was already sitting in the immaculate glass-walled conference room of a high-powered corporate law firm situated on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. Across the expansive, polished mahogany table sat David. He was not a traditional family lawyer who prioritized emotional mediation, gentle interventions, or peaceful familial resolutions. David was a ruthless, terrifyingly efficient financial litigator who specialized exclusively in high-stakes asset recovery, corporate fraud, and hostile corporate takeovers. We had collaborated on several massive federal indictments over the past 5 years, and he possessed the exact type of predatory, uncompromising legal aggression I required for this specific operation. I pushed my heavy encrypted laptop across the smooth surface of the table, granting him full administrative access to the meticulously organized dossier I had compiled over the weekend. I sat back and watched in complete silence as he scrolled through the digital evidence. He reviewed the forged power of attorney, analyzed the predatory commercial loan documents, and meticulously traced the digital logs that tracked the stolen funds flowing directly out of Harrison's fake business account and into Naomi's luxury retail shopping sprees. David did not gasp in shock or offer any pathetic, unprofessional words of sympathy regarding the betrayal. He simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, steepled his fingers, and smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile that signaled absolute legal annihilation. "We are going to completely obliterate them," David stated quietly, his eyes scanning the fraudulent joint tax returns my parents had filed. "But we are not going to do it loudly. We are going to execute a completely silent, lethal financial maneuver. They will not even see the blade until it has already cut them to the bone." First, we initiated the devastating federal protocols. David rapidly drafted a comprehensive, legally binding affidavit detailing the aggravated identity theft, the blatant bank fraud, and the interstate wire fraud. We formally submitted the full encrypted evidence package directly to our established contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Simultaneously, we filed an official identity theft affidavit with the Internal Revenue Service, explicitly flagging their fraudulent tax returns with the Criminal Investigation Division. We were not merely freezing their bank accounts or putting a temporary hold on their credit profiles. We were officially triggering a massive, inescapable federal criminal probe that would inevitably result in severe felony indictments. But the federal government inherently moves slowly, burdened by heavy bureaucracy, and I wanted immediate, catastrophic consequences. I wanted to actively dictate the exact terms of their ruin. I pulled out my phone and opened the real estate link Naomi had arrogantly dropped into the family group chat the previous night. The breathtaking $1.2 million lake house. She had aggressively demanded that I co-sign the mortgage application this morning, assuming my pristine credit was hers to exploit. I slid the phone across the table to David. Instead of co-signing their delusion, I instructed David to immediately establish an anonymous, blind limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. Within 2 hours, the new corporate entity was legally formed, offering complete impenetrable operational secrecy. Using this newly minted blind LLC, David contacted the seller's real estate agent directly. We completely bypassed the entire traditional drawn-out mortgage approval process. We bypassed the standard negotiations and the tedious financial disclosures. I authorized a direct non-refundable wire transfer from my massive recently deposited bonus account. We offered a zero-contingency, heavily expedited all-cash transaction for the full asking price of $1.2 million. The current owner of the property was highly motivated to sell and absolutely thrilled to avoid the complexities and delays of a buyer requiring traditional bank financing. By noon, the preliminary legal paperwork was completely signed, and the digital escrow accounts were fully funded with my liquid capital. The legal deed to the magnificent waterfront estate was secured entirely under the name of the Delaware Blind LLC, of which I was the sole uncontested proprietor. Naomi genuinely thought she was successfully pressuring a desperate, lonely spinster into financing her luxurious dream lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea that the exclusive property she was currently mentally decorating now belonged entirely and legally to me. I was going to let her continue planning her lavish housewarming party. I was going to let her pack her stolen designer clothes into expensive boxes. While the aggressive real estate acquisition was quietly finalized in the background, David executed the secondary, far more devastating phase of our coordinated counterstrike. He compiled a formal, highly aggressive legal cease and desist order, attaching the undisputed, legally binding proof of the forged guarantor signatures and the deliberately falsified notary stamps. I entirely bypassed the lower-level customer service representatives at the predatory lending institution and sent the heavily weaponized legal packet directly to their executive legal counsel. The notification was not a polite request for a payment plan or a simple dispute of charges. It was a brutal, uncompromising legal declaration. David explicitly threatened to bury the bank in federal litigation for blatantly violating basic regulations by accepting a 12-year-old, unverified medical proxy for a $250,000 commercial loan. The immediate consequence of that targeted legal notification was highly predictable and entirely catastrophic for my family. The moment the predatory bank realized their $250,000 loan was completely unsecured and backed by fraudulent, legally void documents, their automated risk management protocols would instantly engage in panic mode. They would aggressively accelerate the debt collection process to recover their lost capital. Because Thomas and Catherine had secretly and recklessly leveraged every single ounce of equity out of their Beacon Hill mansion to fund the initial stages of the fraud, they had absolutely zero financial buffer remaining. The bank would immediately move to seize the only tangible remaining asset left in the entire equation. They would initiate a rapid, highly aggressive foreclosure on the family estate. Thomas and Catherine had arrogantly gambled their entire livelihood on my forced compliance. They had physically thrown me out into the freezing rain, absolutely certain I was too weak, too isolated, and too desperate for family approval to fight back against their unified front. They were currently sitting in their heavily mortgaged living room, confidently waiting for me to apologize and sign my financial life away. They did not realize the ground beneath their feet had already opened up and swallowed them whole. The federal criminal investigations were officially launched. The Dream Lake house was completely out of their reach and fully under my control. And the predatory bank was already actively drafting the legal paperwork to physically evict them from their home. The silent acquisition was entirely complete. Now it was just a matter of time. 48 hours later, I walked through the massive mahogany doors of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a Wednesday evening, the midpoint of Harrison's week-long 30th birthday extravaganza. The sheer scale of the event was physically nauseating. The main ballroom had been transformed into a modern lounge draped in white silk and illuminated by custom neon lighting that spelled out Harrison's name. A live jazz quartet played softly, entirely ignored by the guests mingling near the open bar. I checked my modest coat and smoothed down my simple black dress. I did not look like a woman who had secretly purchased $1 million waterfront estate in cash. I looked exactly like the subdued, obedient sister they desperately needed me to be. I fixed a polite, entirely hollow smile onto my face and stepped into the lion's den. The sensory overload translated into raw data in my mind. Where the guests saw a lavish celebration, I saw a terrifying ledger of stolen capital. I watched a waiter carrying a silver tray of beluga caviar. That was $2,000. I saw the towering centerpieces of imported white orchids. That was another $5,000. The vintage champagne flowing freely represented at least $10,000 in unsecured debt. Every single bite of rich food, every sip of expensive wine, and every laugh echoing across the ceiling was directly funded by the forged commercial loan bearing my name. They were literally eating my financial future. Yet I did not feel the crushing anxiety they intended to inflict upon me. I felt the chilling, detached calm of a bomb squad technician who had completely neutralized the explosive device. "Stella, you actually showed up!" a shrill voice called out. Naomi detached herself from a group of wealthy wives and glided toward me. She wore a stunning, backless crimson gown, paired with a diamond tennis bracelet that I knew cost exactly $18,000 because I had personally tracked the wire transfer from Harrison's fake business account. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my plain dress. "I am so glad you decided to stop being incredibly selfish," Naomi said, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "Your mother was worried you were going to throw another pathetic tantrum. Have you spoken to the mortgage broker yet about the lake house? We need your signature finalized by tomorrow morning to lock in the escrow." I smiled back at her. "I am taking care of the lake house paperwork, Naomi," I replied smoothly. "Everything is moving exactly as it should." Naomi beamed, entirely oblivious to the lethal double meaning of my words. She took a long sip of her champagne, adjusting her stolen diamond bracelet. "Good," she said, leaning in closer. "Harrison is making massive moves tonight. He is currently pitching the core infrastructure of his new application to a group of angel investors. We cannot afford to have a jealous sister dragging down his public image. Just stand in the corner, drink your water, and try to look supportive for once in your life." She turned on her heel and glided back to her audience, instantly launching into a fabricated story about managing multiple high-end properties. I watched her walk away, my polite smile never wavering. She was bragging about $1 million lake house that legally belonged entirely to me, funded by a man exactly 48 hours away from a federal indictment. I drifted toward the center of the room. Harrison was holding court near the glass windows, surrounded by three wealthy local businessmen. He was wearing a bespoke tailored suit and speaking with the practiced confidence of a seasoned con artist. I stood close enough to hear his pitch. He threw around meaningless technology buzzwords, talking about disruptive blockchain algorithms and decentralized networking paradigms. It was absolute, unadulterated vaporware. He had no software engineers on payroll. He had absolutely no product. He was stringing together expensive-sounding syllables to convince these naive men to hand over their retirement funds to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat. It was a pure masterclass in sociopathic deception. Across the room, Thomas and Catherine aggressively worked the crowd. My father loudly bragged to a golf buddy about Harrison's visionary genius, casually swirling a glass of scotch he purchased using the secret, devastating second mortgage on his home. Catherine showed off pictures of the lake house on her phone, explicitly claiming Harrison was buying it outright with his tech profits. They had convinced themselves that reality was something they could simply manipulate with enough stolen money and gaslighting. They looked at me standing quietly by the wall and exchanged a smug, victorious glance. They genuinely believed they had broken me. They thought my silence was absolute submission. They thought the threat of being cut out of this rotting family had forced me into absolute compliance. I raised my glass of sparkling water, offering a small toast to my father across the crowded ballroom. The sheer, intoxicating power of knowing the absolute truth was better than any expensive champagne. Let them eat the imported caviar. Let them wear the stolen diamonds and brag about the imaginary tech empires. I knew the bank was already drafting foreclosure notices on my parents' estate. I knew federal investigators were reviewing the undeniable proof of Harrison's wire fraud. I knew the Dream Lake house was legally locked in a blind trust bearing my name alone. I stood in the exact center of the lion's den, surrounded by the roaring beasts who tried to tear me apart for my resources. But I was not the prey anymore. I was simply the executioner, patiently waiting for the clock to strike zero, holding the digital detonator completely hidden in the palm of my hand. The ambient noise of the jazz quartet faded seamlessly into the background as the waitstaff began circulating with fresh trays of crystal flutes. The informal mingling of the evening was transitioning rapidly into the highly orchestrated formal cocktail hour. I remained perfectly still near the wall, a silent, unmoving observer wrapped in my simple black dress. The ballroom lights dimmed to a dramatic warm gold, and a sudden sharp tapping sound cut through the low hum of wealthy, arrogant chatter. Catherine was standing at the exact center of the room, positioned strategically in front of a towering custom ice sculpture. She held a silver microphone in her right hand and a freshly poured glass of vintage champagne in her left. The crowd naturally gravitated toward her, forming a tight, expectant circle. Harrison stood to her right, puffing out his chest in a bespoke suit he had not paid for, while Naomi clung to his arm, glittering in stolen diamonds. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" Catherine announced, her voice echoing flawlessly through the state-of-the-art sound system. A hushed, respectful silence fell over the city's elite. Doctors, local politicians, and wealthy real estate developers turned their complete attention to my mother. She beamed under the spotlight, absolutely thriving in the fabricated glory of the moment. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a monumental milestone." Catherine began, her tone perfectly modulated to project warmth and maternal pride. 30 years ago, Thomas and I were blessed with a son who was destined for absolute greatness. We knew from the very beginning that Harrison was special. He possesses a rare visionary mind. While other men his age are settling for mediocrity, climbing slow corporate ladders, Harrison is actively building an empire. He is disrupting the technology sector, creating massive opportunities, and securing a legacy that will elevate this entire family. A polite, appreciative murmur rippled through the crowd. Harrison offered a humble, practiced nod, playing the role of the grounded genius to absolute perfection. Naomi smiled radiantly, making sure the ballroom lighting caught the facets of her $18,000 bracelet. "Of course, a man is only as strong as the family that supports him." Catherine continued, her voice taking on a deliberate theatrical edge. "Thomas and I have sacrificed everything to ensure Harrison had the capital and the freedom to pursue his incredible dreams. Family is a single unified front. We lift each other up. We pool our resources. We do not let petty jealousy or selfish individualism hold back true genius." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach, not from fear, but from the sheer breathtaking audacity of her narrative. She was standing in front of 200 people, publicly praising her own financial sacrifice, completely omitting the fact that her sacrifice consisted of secretly mortgaging her house and committing federal identity theft to steal $250,000 in my name. Catherine paused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked directly onto me, standing alone in the shadows by the wall. A cruel, calculated smirk touched the corners of her mouth. She had the entire room eating out of the palm of her hand, and she was about to use that massive social leverage to deliver the ultimate public execution of my character. "We are so incredibly blessed to have Harrison," Catherine projected into the microphone, her voice dripping with toxic manufactured pity. "And we are so very glad that his older sister Stella could finally join us tonight." She gestured toward me with her champagne flute, forcing the entire ballroom to turn and look in my direction. I felt hundreds of eyes suddenly evaluating my plain dress, my lack of jewelry, and my solitary stance. "We are so glad Stella could be here to learn what real tangible ambition actually looks like," Catherine said, her voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "It is never too late to be inspired. Even if she is 33 years old, entirely alone, and with absolutely nothing to her name, she can still witness the greatness of her younger brother." We can only hope that being surrounded by such success tonight will finally motivate her to stop settling for a small, bitter life and start contributing to the world. The silence in the ballroom held for a fraction of a second before the crowd reacted. It started as a low collective murmur, quickly evolving into polite elitist chuckles. I watched the wealthy wives exchange amused, pitying glances. I saw the local businessmen shake their heads quietly, judging the tragic, unsuccessful spinster sister who had to be publicly shamed into supporting her visionary brother. Naomi actually let out a sharp melodic laugh, leaning her head on Harrison's shoulder, as if my public humiliation was the most entertaining performance of the evening. Thomas simply stood there, nodding in solemn agreement, actively endorsing the brutal psychological warfare his wife was executing. They expected me to break. They had engineered this precise moment to maximize my emotional devastation. In their minds, a normal woman would have burst into tears, covered her face, and run out of the country club in absolute shame. A normal daughter would have been completely crushed by the weight of her own mother, declaring her a worthless, isolated failure in front of the most powerful people in the city. They wanted to force my absolute submission by completely destroying my public dignity so I would sign their mortgage documents the next morning just to buy their conditional love. But I did not run. I did not cry. I did not even break eye contact with Catherine. I stood perfectly still, breathing evenly, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of the small designer purse hanging securely from my right shoulder. Inside that leather purse, neatly folded in a sealed, waterproof envelope, was the physical, legally binding deed to the $1.2 million waterfront estate. Naomi was currently telling her friends she was buying. It was registered entirely to my anonymous Delaware corporation, completely untouchable and fully paid in cash. Sitting right next to that deed was a printed confirmation sheet from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, complete with the federal tracking numbers assigned to the massive tax fraud and identity theft case I had personally initiated against my parents. And tucked securely behind those documents was a digital copy of the aggressive cease and desist order. My attorney had already delivered to the predatory lending bank an action that was currently triggering the immediate foreclosure of the very home my parents planned to return to tonight. Catherine had a microphone, a stolen glass of champagne, and the polite laughter of a room full of strangers. She had the temporary fragile illusion of absolute social dominance. I had the complete devastating legal power to instantly obliterate her entire reality. I looked at my mother standing under the bright lights, her face flushed with the toxic thrill of her own cruelty. I looked at Harrison, the fake billionaire, and Naomi, the fraudulent socialite. I let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat or forced politeness. It was the terrifying cold smile of a predator watching its prey happily walk directly into a locked cage. I slowly raised my glass of sparkling water into the air, holding it steady toward Catherine in a perfectly silent, mocking toast. I took a slow sip, enjoying the crisp, clean taste, completely unbothered by the laughter of the crowd. They could enjoy their stolen caviar and their fake empire for one more night. The clock was already ticking, and I knew exactly how this party was going to end. The rest of the cocktail hour passed in a blur of fake smiles and stolen champagne. By the time the event finally concluded, I had already mentally checked out my focus, entirely shifted to the next critical phase of the operation. The following morning was a crisp, brilliantly clear Thursday, the day of Harrison's final culminating birthday gala. My phone began buzzing relentlessly at 8 o'clock sharp. The family group chat was erupting with demands from Catherine, reminding everyone about the mandatory, highly orchestrated family brunch scheduled at a luxury downtown bistro. I did not respond. I simply engaged the silent feature on my device, tossed it onto the passenger seat of my car, and drove in the exact opposite direction. I left the crowded, noisy city limits completely behind, navigating the winding, tree-lined roads that led out toward the exclusive waterfront district. The air grew colder, cleaner, and heavily scented with pine. After 40 minutes of uninterrupted driving, I turned off the main coastal highway and approached a massive wrought iron security gate. I did not need to buzz a security guard or wait for a resident to grant me temporary access. I simply rolled down my window, entered the proprietary master code provided directly by my attorney, and watched the heavy metal gates swing open smoothly. I drove down the long, immaculate cobblestone driveway, the dense canopy of ancient oak trees, parting to reveal the stunning $1.2 million property, the lake house. It was an absolute architectural masterpiece. Three massive stories of modern glass, rich cedar wood, and dark slate stone, perfectly integrated into the sloping, highly manicured landscape. A private deep water dock extended elegantly into the sparkling, icy blue waters of the lake. This was the exact house Naomi had been aggressively bragging about for weeks. This was the luxurious sanctuary she genuinely believed she was moving into by the end of the month, funded entirely by my forced signature and my stolen financial stability. I parked my modest sedan in the expansive heated driveway, stepping out into the absolute breathtaking silence of the private estate. I walked up to the heavy custom mahogany front door. There was no hesitation. There was no waiting for a frantic real estate agent to show me around. I reached into my coat pocket, retrieved the heavy brass key I had received yesterday afternoon, and slid it directly into the lock. The deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying heavy thud. I pushed the door wide open and stepped inside, instantly breathing in the crisp, distinct scent of fresh paint, polished hardwood, and quiet, absolute luxury. The interior was cavernous and flooded with brilliant natural light pouring in from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the water. The house was currently empty, completely stripped of furniture, waiting patiently for its new owner to fill it. It was waiting for me. I walked slowly through the massive open-concept kitchen, running my hand along the cool, pristine surface of the imported white marble countertops. Every single inch of this magnificent estate was legally, undeniably mine. There was no mortgage. There was no bank holding a predatory lien against the property. It was paid for entirely in liquid cash secured by the sheer brilliance and brutal discipline I had applied to my career for the past decade. The contrast between this solid, unshakable reality and the fragile, debt-fueled illusion my family was currently desperately maintaining was incredibly profound. While they were sitting at a downtown bistro right now, eating overpriced eggs, Benedict funded by fraudulent credit and gaslighting each other about imaginary tech empires, I was standing safely inside a $1 million fortress that I owned completely outright. I moved through the expansive living room and pushed open the heavy glass sliding doors, stepping out onto the massive multi-level wooden deck that cantilevered dramatically over the edge of the property, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the pristine lake. The morning air was sharp and biting, but the winter sun provided a bright, highly flattering natural light. I walked over to a small built-in teakwood bar area near the edge of the railing. I had brought two highly specific props with me this morning. From my bag, I pulled out a chilled premium bottle of vintage champagne, the exact same expensive brand Catherine had been aggressively flaunting at the country club last night, and a single crystal flute. I popped the cork, the sharp crack echoing loudly across the empty lake, and poured the pale gold liquid into the glass. Then I reached back into my leather bag and retrieved the heavy waterproof envelope. I carefully extracted the thick, legally binding physical deed to the property. It was printed on heavy watermarked parchment clearly displaying the property address and the official registration seal of my anonymous Delaware corporation. I placed the deed flat on the dark teakwood surface of the bar, ensuring the official state seals and the property address were perfectly visible. I pulled out my phone, accessing the high-definition camera. I positioned myself flawlessly against the railing, the sparkling, expansive lake, providing a breathtaking backdrop. I framed the shot with absolute precision. In the immediate foreground, resting on the rich wood, was the undeniable legal deed to the estate. My hand rested casually next to it, holding the crystal flute of expensive champagne. I made sure my face was clearly visible, my expression calm, radiant, and radiating the kind of authentic, effortless power that my family had spent their entire lives trying to fake. I tapped the screen, locking the focus, and snapped the perfect high-quality photograph. I reviewed the image, ensuring every single detail was razor-sharp. It was a beautiful, completely devastating piece of digital evidence. I opened my primary social media application, the exact platform where I was connected to Catherine Harrison Naomi and every single one of their wealthy, influential country club friends. I uploaded the pristine photograph. The caption required absolute surgical precision. It needed to be elegant, brief, and completely lethal. I typed slowly, carefully choosing every single word. Cheers to quiet investments and massive returns. So incredibly thrilled to finally close on this stunning waterfront estate this morning. Paid in full entirely in cash. Hard work and total financial independence truly is the absolute best revenge. Cannot wait to start moving my things in this weekend. I did not hit the publish button immediately. That would be a complete waste of tactical leverage. I wanted maximum catastrophic impact. I wanted to detonate this bomb at the exact moment they felt the most invincible. I accessed the advanced scheduling feature on the application. Harrison was scheduled to take the center stage at the Grand Ballroom tonight at exactly 9 o'clock to deliver his keynote address to the local angel investors. I set the digital timer for the social media post to drop publicly at exactly 8:59. I locked the phone screen and slipped it safely back into my coat pocket. I picked up the crystal flute, took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the cold champagne, and looked out across the vast, quiet water. The trap was fully set. The timing was absolutely flawless. I turned around, picked up my legal deed, and walked back inside to lock up my new home. It was time to head back to the city and prepare for the final show. I arrived back in the city just as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I returned to my apartment changed into a completely different, highly structured emerald green evening gown and drove straight to the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel. The final night of Harrison's birthday week was not just a party. It was a highly calculated investor summit masked as a black tie gala. Over 100 carefully selected guests were already seated at grand circular tables draped in heavy black velvet. The room was a masterclass in aggressive opulence featuring massive crystal chandeliers and towering centerpieces of imported black roses. I slipped into the ballroom completely unnoticed, taking a designated seat at a shadowed table near the heavy brass exit doors. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with the smell of expensive cologne and the quiet hum of massive financial transactions waiting to happen. At precisely 8:55, the house lights dimmed. A single brilliant white spotlight snapped onto the center of the massive stage. The crowd fell into a hushed, reverent silence. Harrison strode out from the wings, soaking in the applause like a seasoned politician. He was wearing a brand new, custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that I knew he had charged to a freshly opened, highly illegal line of credit. He approached the sleek acrylic podium, gripping the edges with practiced, arrogant confidence. Naomi was seated at the very front table, glowing under the stage lights, completely surrounded by the wealthy wives she had been ruthlessly courting all week. Thomas and Catherine flanked her, looking incredibly smug and victorious. They were all waiting for the kill. They were waiting for Harrison to secure the final round of angel investments that would legitimize their massive, desperate fraud. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Harrison began, his voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art microphone system. This week has been an incredible celebration of vision, innovation, and most importantly, family. We are on the absolute precipice of a massive technological breakthrough with my new software platform. The capital we raised tonight will permanently disrupt the market. The angel investors in the front rows nodded approvingly, completely hypnotized by his baseless confidence. Harrison paused, letting the silence build for maximum dramatic effect. He flashed a brilliant rehearsed smile down at Naomi. But tonight is not just about corporate milestones. Harrison continued, his tone softening into a fake, deeply emotional register. It is also about personal foundations. I am incredibly proud to officially announce that tomorrow morning, Naomi and I will be formally closing on a breathtaking $1.2 million waterfront estate. The Lake House. It represents everything we have worked so hard to build, and it will serve as the core headquarters for our new empire. The crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Naomi beamed, placing a perfectly manicured hand over her heart, playing the role of the humble, supportive wife to absolute perfection. Thomas slapped the table in triumph. Catherine looked like she was going to faint from sheer pride. They were flying so incredibly high, utterly convinced that their fabricated reality had successfully become absolute truth. I checked the platinum watch on my left wrist. The sweeping second hand ticked past 8:58. I pulled my phone from my clutch. Earlier today I had drafted a post, but looking at the sheer suffocating arrogance radiating from the stage, I knew it needed to be sharper. It needed to be a direct lethal strike to the throat. I quickly deleted the original draft and typed a new brutally honest caption. Family forgot my 33rd birthday. No worries. I used my corporate bonus to buy the $1.2 million lake house in cash. Birthday gift. To myself. I attached the flawless high-resolution photograph of myself holding the crystal champagne flute with the physical deed to the estate clearly visible on the teakwood bar. I did not just post it to my feed. I specifically utilized the tagging feature. I tagged Harrison, I tagged Naomi, I tagged Thomas and Catherine. Then, using the extensive contact list I had meticulously scraped from Naomi's public event page, I individually tagged every single high-profile investor, real estate developer, and country club socialite currently sitting in the ballroom. The digital clock on my screen flipped to 8:59. I pressed publish. For exactly 10 seconds, the ballroom remained completely focused on Harrison, who was just starting to launch into the highly technical, entirely fabricated financial projections of his vaporware startup. Then the absolute silence was violently shattered. It started as a scattered, isolated sound. A sharp chime from a table near the front. A short buzz from a purse in the middle aisle. Within 3 seconds, a massive synchronized wave of digital notifications swept across the entire ballroom. 100 high-end smartphones began pinging, buzzing, and chiming simultaneously. The sheer volume of the alerts echoed off the marble walls like a swarm of locusts. Harrison faltered, his smooth, practiced cadence breaking as the distracting noise overwhelmed the sound system. He gripped the podium, looking down at the crowd in sudden confusion. Please, if everyone could just silence their devices, he requested, his fake smile straining at the edges. But no one was looking at him anymore. 100 pairs of eyes were violently pulled downward, staring intently at the glowing screens of their phones. The coordinated tag had bypassed their silent modes, forcing the high-priority notification directly onto their locked screens. I sat perfectly still in the shadows, watching the exact moment the social shockwave hit the room. An older angel investor in the front row, a man who was allegedly preparing to hand Harrison a massive check, violently snatched his phone off the table. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening in absolute shock. He looked at the photograph of the deed, read the brutal caption, and then snapped his head up to glare directly at Harrison. The investor sitting next to him leaned over, whispering furiously while pointing at the screen. The polite, respectful silence of the gala completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a rising, chaotic tide of frantic whispers and sharp gasps. Naomi reached blindly into her designer clutch, her hands shaking violently. She pulled out her phone, the screen already illuminated with 50 different text messages from the women sitting right behind her. I watched her face drain of all color, transforming into a pale, sickening shade of white. Her jaw literally dropped open. She looked exactly like a woman who had just stepped out of a plane, only to realize she was not wearing a parachute. Catherine and Thomas were completely frozen, staring at Naomi's screen. My mother raised a trembling hand to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing with absolute crushing certainty that the city's most elite power brokers were currently reading undeniable proof that her golden son was a complete fraud. The room was turning against them in real time. Harrison stood completely exposed on the massive stage, entirely oblivious to the lethal digital payload that had just detonated in the crowd. "What is going on?" he demanded into the microphone. His voice cracking, the arrogant tech visionary facade crumbling into the desperate panic of a cornered child. "Why is everyone looking at their phones?" I picked up my small clutch, stood up from my shadowed table, and smoothed out my emerald gown. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had completely shattered their entire world into a million irreversible pieces. I did not need to stay and watch the bloodbath. I turned my back on the chaotic, self-destructing ballroom, pushed open the heavy brass doors, and walked out into the cool, quiet night. I had my hand resting on the cold metal of the heavy brass exit door, fully prepared to disappear into the quiet night, when the sound physically stopped me in my tracks. It was not a surprised gasp or a polite cry of dismay. It was a visceral, entirely unhinged shriek that tore violently through the tense atmosphere of the ballroom, completely drowning out the low hum of the confused crowd. I let the heavy door swing shut, the latch clicking securely into place. I turned back around, stepping out from the shadows at the very back of the room. Naomi was standing at the front table, her chair knocked backward onto the polished marble floor. She was staring at her screen as if the device had just burst into flames in her bare hands. The pristine, confident socialite facade had completely melted away, leaving behind a terrified, hyperventilating shell. She looked frantically up at the massive stage, pointing a violently shaking finger at Harrison, her mouth opening and closing, but entirely unable to form any coherent words. The sheer terror in her scream acted as a violent catalyst for the entire room. The scattered whispers instantly erupted into a deafening, chaotic roar. Over 100 elite investors, powerful socialites, and ruthless real estate moguls simultaneously lifted their eyes from the undeniable digital proof of my absolute ownership of the lake house and locked their furious glares directly onto the man standing at the podium. The collective realization hit the grand ballroom with the devastating force of a freight train. The brilliant tech visionary, pitching them a massive financial opportunity, was actually a desperate, completely broke fraud who could not even afford the very house he was aggressively bragging about closing on tomorrow. Thomas and Catherine were completely frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing shock. My mother was gripping the edge of the velvet-draped table so hard her knuckles were bone white, her panicked eyes darting wildly between Naomi's phone and the rapidly turning crowd. The smug, victorious glow that had illuminated her face all evening was completely eradicated, instantly replaced by the horrifying, inescapable dawn of total public ruin. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking deliberately up the center aisle. The ballroom was descending into total chaos, but the physical space immediately around me seemed to fall into a heavy vacuum of silence. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the pristine marble floor echoed loudly, cutting directly through the frantic shouts of the investors demanding immediate answers. Heads began to turn rapidly. The wealthy guests closest to the center aisle stepped back, parting like the Red Sea, their eyes wide as they suddenly recognized the woman from the devastating photograph. I was no longer the pathetic, isolated spinster sister they had been cruelly mocking just 24 hours ago. I was the executioner, and I was walking directly toward the guillotine. Two heavily built private security guards, hired specifically for the high-profile event, stepped forward in unison to block the stage stairs. I did not slow down. I did not even break my measured stride. I looked the lead guard dead in the eye, my expression completely devoid of any hesitation, fear, or submission. "I am the woman who just purchased the $1 million estate he is currently lying to you about," I stated, my voice dangerously calm and laced with absolute terrifying authority. "Step aside right now, or you will be officially named as a willing co-conspirator in the massive federal wire fraud case dropping tomorrow morning." The large guard hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously from my completely stoic face to the panicked, aggressively sweating man up at the podium. He took one look at the absolute meltdown happening at the front table, realized the massive legal liability he was currently standing in front of, and wisely took a massive step back, lowering his arm in silent surrender. I ascended the short flight of carpeted stairs and stepped directly onto the brightly lit stage. Harrison was actively hyperventilating, his hands gripping the edges of the clear acrylic podium so tightly the thick plastic audibly groaned. The bespoke midnight blue tuxedo suddenly looked exactly like a cheap stolen costume. He stared at me in absolute unadulterated terror as I walked directly up to him. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a lie, a threat, or a pathetic excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The arrogant tech mogul was gone, replaced entirely by a terrified child facing the brutal consequences of his own actions. I did not wait for him to find his voice. I reached out and took the silver microphone directly from his trembling hand. He let it go without a single ounce of resistance, stepping backward rapidly, as if he had just been physically struck. I turned slowly to face the chaotic ballroom. I did not tap the microphone. I simply stood at the exact center of the stage, radiating cold, untouchable power, and waited for the sheer gravity of my presence to command their absolute attention. It took less than 10 seconds. The furious, overlapping shouting slowly died down into a tense, dangerous murmur. The frantic investors stopped aggressively demanding their deposits back from Thomas. Every single person in the massive room locked their eyes on me, holding their collective breath, waiting for the final lethal blow. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting flawlessly through the high-end sound system, entirely steady and completely devoid of any emotional wavering. "My name is Stella. I am a senior investigator specializing in federal forensic accounting. And I am the legal sole owner of the waterfront estate my brother just attempted to use as collateral to secure your capital investments." A collective sharp intake of breath echoed heavily through the room. The man standing behind me is not a visionary. I continued my words, clipping through the tense air with absolute surgical precision. He does not have a revolutionary software platform. He does not have a single development team on payroll. What he does have is $250,000 in highly illegal unsecured commercial debt obtained directly through aggravated identity theft and heavily forged legal documents. Harrison let out a pathetic, choked sob, collapsing backward against the heavy stage curtains and burying his face in his shaking hands. Down at the front table, Catherine suddenly stood up her chair, screeching violently against the marble floor. "Stella, stop it right now," she shrieked, her voice cracking with absolute raw desperation. "She is lying to you all. She is completely insane and deeply jealous. Do not listen to a single word she says." I looked down at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. "I have already submitted the complete, heavily encrypted dossier of forged signatures, fraudulent joint tax returns, and stolen wire transfers directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I stated clearly, ensuring every single investor in the room heard the highly specific federal agencies. "The official tracking numbers are attached directly to the legal deed you all just received on your phones. I highly recommend you check them." The grand ballroom erupted again, this time with aggressive, targeted fury. The wealthy businessmen who had been cheerfully sharing expensive scotch with Thomas just an hour ago were now actively surrounding his table, their faces red with intense rage, aggressively demanding the immediate return of their preliminary investment checks. Naomi was sobbing hysterically, burying her face deeply into her crossed arms, completely shattered by the absolute, irreversible destruction of her entire social standing. Furthermore, I announced, raising my voice just slightly to cut through the rising panic, "The predatory lending institution that issued the fraudulent initial capital has already been legally notified by my attorney. The forged guarantor documents have been entirely voided. Because my parents secretly leveraged their entire Beacon Hill estate to fund this criminal enterprise, the bank is aggressively accelerating the debt collection process. The formal foreclosure proceedings on their home have already been officially initiated." Thomas physically collapsed back into his chair, his face entirely ashen, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared blankly at the crystal chandelier above. The brutal reality of his complete financial annihilation had finally broken through his impenetrable wall of suburban arrogance. He had gambled his entire livelihood on my forced submission, and he had just lost everything. I turned slightly to look at Harrison. He was curled in on himself, shaking violently, his entirely fabricated empire reduced to digital ash in front of the most powerful and dangerous people in the city. "You wanted to build a lasting legacy, Harrison," I said quietly, the sensitive microphone picking up the cold, devastating finality in my voice perfectly. "Congratulations. You are going to be remembered by this entire city for a very, very long time." I did not wait for a single response. I placed the silver microphone gently down onto the clear acrylic podium. The loud, heavy thud echoed loudly through the speakers, sounding exactly like a federal judge banging a heavy wooden gavel. The meltdown was completely absolute. The destruction was total. I turned my back on them, and walked gracefully off the stage, my head held high, leaving my family entirely to the mercy of the furious crowd they had just tried to ruthlessly scam. I reached the heavy brass exit doors at the back of the room when a sharp, booming voice sliced directly through the escalating chaos. "Stop right there!" It was Richard Vance, a prominent venture capitalist, who had been sitting in the very front row. He stood up, his face flushed red with a mixture of intense anger and disbelief. "You cannot just make massive federal allegations like that and walk out the door," he demanded, pointing a thick finger across the crowded room. "You claim this is a massive fraud. Where is the actual tangible proof?" I stopped. I did not sigh or show any hesitation. I simply turned around on my heel, my emerald gown sweeping across the polished floor. I walked directly back up the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight. The crowd parted for me once again. Harrison flinched violently as I ascended the stairs and approached the clear acrylic podium for the second time. I picked up the silver microphone. "You want the physical proof, Richard?" I asked. My voice was deadly calm, completely devoid of any yelling or theatrical emotion. It was sharp, clinical, and devastatingly loud over the public address system. "I am a senior forensic accountant. I do not deal in dramatic, empty accusations. I deal exclusively in raw data, and numbers absolutely do not lie." I unclasped the heavy gold lock on my structured leather designer tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out 3 thick, professionally bound forensic audit reports. The heavy stacks of premium paper landed on the podium with a solid, undeniable thud. "Let us break down the exact financial architecture of my brother's visionary empire," I announced to the captive, hyperventilating room. "It begins precisely 6 months ago. The foundation of this entire startup was not secured through venture capital hard work or technological patents. It was secured through a highly illegal, heavily forged medical power of attorney." I opened the first binder and held up a massive, high-resolution color copy of the legal document. My parents, Thomas and Catherine, utilized a 12-year-old medical proxy from when I was hospitalized in college. They illegally manipulated this voided document, deliberately forged my signature, and explicitly used my pristine credit profile to secure a massive commercial loan behind my back. The total principal amount was exactly $250,000. Gasps rippled through the front rows. The wealthy investors were suddenly leaning in, their eyes locked onto the paperwork in my hands. I continued methodically tearing down their entire illusion digit by digit. This $250,000 was immediately deposited into a corporate holding account registered to a newly formed Delaware entity. Harrison explicitly claimed this entity was an advanced software development firm. However, a forensic trace of the banking routing numbers reveals absolutely zero outgoing payments to any software engineers, server hosts, or technology vendors. Zero. I picked up the first bound report, walked to the edge of the stage, and handed it directly down to Richard Vance. He snatched it from my hands, immediately flipping to the flagged banking ledgers. 2 other investors crowded around his shoulders, their eyes frantically scanning the highlighted columns. "Instead of funding technological innovation," I stated, pacing slowly across the front of the stage, "that $250,000 was rapidly liquidated through a series of highly questionable personal wire transfers. Let us look at the exact distributions over the past 90 days. I looked directly at Naomi. She was shaking so violently her chair was rattling against the table. Exactly $42,500 was wired directly to a luxury automotive dealership to secure the leases on 2 imported sports cars. I recited from memory, the numbers acting as verbal bullets. Exactly $18,000 was transferred to a private jeweler for the diamond tennis bracelet currently sitting on my sister-in-law's right wrist. Another $26,400 was spent at various high-end retail boutiques across the city, exclusively funding the designer wardrobe Naomi has been aggressively flaunting at your country club luncheons. The wealthy wives sitting near Naomi physically recoiled from her, pulling their chairs away, as if her financial fraud was a highly contagious disease. The remaining capital, I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly, was systematically bled dry to fund the deposits for this ridiculous birthday gala, the vintage champagne you are all currently drinking, and the aggressively marketed illusion that Harrison was a successful executive. He is not an executive, He is a heavily indebted con artist running a desperate, disorganized Ponzi scheme. I walked back to the podium and picked up the second and third bound reports. I handed them down to the other major investors, aggressively crowding the front of the stage. They ripped the folders open. The undeniable paper trail was laid out in high-definition color. Bank statements, IP addresses, forged notary stamps, and direct wire transfers linking Harrison's fake corporate accounts directly to Naomi's luxury shopping habits. And as for the $1.2 million lake house, he just promised you would serve as his new corporate headquarters, I added, delivering the final fatal blow. I purchased that estate at 9 o'clock this morning. It is completely paid off. The title is registered entirely to a blind trust that I absolutely control. Harrison does not have a single dollar of equity in that property. I fully intended to use your investment capital tonight to somehow illegally cover the escrow on a house he never even had the clearance to bid on. The reaction was instantaneous and violently explosive. Richard Vance slammed the audit report onto his table. He pointed directly at Harrison, his face contorted in absolute rage. "You completely arrogant, fraudulent sociopath!" Richard roared, his voice carrying over the massive room. "You tried to leverage my retirement fund to pay off your wife's credit card bills." The domino effect was immediate. The entire front row of investors stood up in unison. Chairs were knocked backward, crashing onto the marble floor. Dozens of furious, powerful men and women began advancing toward Thomas, Catherine, and Harrison. They were aggressively waving the forensic reports in the air, shouting over each other, demanding the immediate cancellation of their checks and the instant return of their preliminary wire transfers. "Call the police right now," one of the real estate developers screamed at the event security staff. "Do not let these people leave the building." Harrison backed away from the edge of the stage, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "I did not mean it," he stammered, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, terrified whine. "It was just a temporary bridge loan. I was going to pay it all back once the application launched, I swear to you." No one was listening to him. The sophisticated high-stakes technology summit had instantly devolved into a chaotic, aggressive mob of furious creditors. Catherine was openly weeping, clutching her expensive purse to her chest, as the investors surrounded her table demanding financial answers she literally did not possess. I stood at the edge of the stage for one final moment, watching the precise, calculated destruction of the family that had tried to destroy me. The execution by numbers was completely flawless. There was absolutely nothing left for them to hide behind. The raw, undeniable data had burned their fabricated reality straight to the ground. I stepped back from the podium, bypassed the paralyzed security guards, and walked quietly down the side stairs, disappearing into the shadows as the grand ballroom completely descended into financial anarchy. I had taken exactly 3 steps down the carpeted side staircase when the heavy, sickening sound of shattering glass echoed violently from the front of the ballroom. I stopped, turning slowly back toward the brightly lit stage. The temporary paralysis that had gripped my family was over, instantly replaced by explosive, unfiltered panic. But it was not Harrison who broke first. It was Thomas. The polished, arrogant country club patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He had violently shoved his way past a group of furious real estate developers, knocking over a towering crystal centerpiece in the process. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging prominently against his expensive silk collar. He charged directly toward the stage, his heavy footsteps thudding loudly against the wooden risers. He did not care about the 100 wealthy witnesses actively recording the meltdown on their phones. He did not care about the investors aggressively demanding their stolen capital back. His absolute, unadulterated rage was focused entirely on me. "You ungrateful, vindictive little traitor!" Thomas roared, his voice tearing raw and ugly through the chaotic noise of the room. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face, stopping just short of the clear acrylic podium. I was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his tailored suit jacket. "You are actively destroying your own blood. We gave you absolutely everything. We are your family. We are the only reason you even exist, and you march in here and publicly ruin your own brother out of pure, spiteful jealousy. You are sick. You are a sick, twisted girl." I stood perfectly still, watching the spit fly from his mouth, entirely unmoved by his aggressive physical display. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was physically nauseating, but I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. Less than a week ago, this exact man had physically grabbed my shoulders and violently shoved me out of his front door into the freezing torrential rain. He had done it simply because I refused to be his financial sacrificial lamb. He had expected me to shatter under the weight of his rejection. He had expected me to crawl back to him the very next morning, begging for his conditional approval and offering my signature on whatever fraudulent documents he demanded. Instead, I had spent the past week forging myself into absolute unbreakable ice. The intense emotional freeze I had rigorously maintained was paying off perfectly. He had absolutely zero power over me. He could not intimidate me, he could not manipulate me, and he could no longer control the narrative. I stepped calmly away from the shadows of the staircase and walked directly back to the exact center of the stage. I looked down at the man who had tried to throw my entire future into a shredder to protect a con artist. I reached out and picked up the silver microphone for the final time. The sharp, piercing feedback immediately silenced the shouting investors surrounding the front tables. "You did not give me anything, Thomas," I said, my voice echoing cold, clinical, and devastatingly loud over the public address system. The sheer volume of my calm tone cut through his frantic screaming like a surgical scalpel. "And I am not destroying my family. I am simply auditing them." Thomas opened his mouth to scream another insult, but I cut him off instantly, my voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. "I am a forensic accountant, Thomas. I do not operate on childish emotion, and I certainly do not operate on blind toxic loyalty. I operate strictly on undeniable documented facts." I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away the very last shred of his fabricated patriarchal authority in front of the most powerful people in the city. I just handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a perfectly wrapped, incredibly lucrative case of aggravated identity theft and interstate wire fraud. The evidence is entirely airtight. There are no loopholes. There are no plea deals that will save him. Harrison is going to federal prison, and if you and Catherine actually sign those forged notary stamps, you will be in the exact same holding cell. Thomas recoiled instantly, stumbling backward a half step, as if he had been physically struck directly in the chest. His aggressive posture collapsed, his broad shoulders suddenly slumping under the crushing, inescapable weight of federal consequences. The furious red color drained rapidly from his face, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. But I was not finished. The final nail in the coffin was still resting securely in my pocket. I leaned closer to the microphone, answering every single syllable carried the weight of absolute, undeniable destruction. Furthermore, I announced, shifting my gaze to include Catherine, who was now openly sobbing loudly at the ruined front table. The massive commercial bank you tried to defraud with that fake medical proxy was officially notified of the forged guarantor documents yesterday afternoon by my elite legal counsel. The $250,000 loan is completely void. And because you secretly leveraged every single dime of equity out of your Beacon Hill mansion to fund Harrison's illegal shell company, you left yourselves entirely exposed. I paused for exactly 2 seconds, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. The wealthy country club socialites who had previously idolized my parents were now staring at them in absolute disgusted horror. The bank immediately engaged their maximum risk recovery protocols, I stated clearly. They are executing the formal foreclosure on your house at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The local sheriff's department already has the eviction notice. You have absolutely no capital to fight it, and you have no legal ground to stand on. You gambled your entire home on my silent compliance, and you lost absolutely everything. The microphone amplified the quiet, pathetic gasp that escaped Thomas's throat. He reached out blindly, grabbing the edge of the stage to keep himself from collapsing completely to the marble floor. He looked around the grand ball, his eyes searching frantically for a single sympathetic face among his wealthy peers. He found nothing but cold, furious contempt. He had been brutally exposed as a broke, fraudulent failure, the exact thing he despised the most in the world. He turned his eyes back up to me, his expression completely hollowed out by total despair. I simply looked back at him, feeling absolutely nothing but the quiet, deep satisfaction of a perfectly executed, flawless audit. I turned away from my father and looked out over the rapidly disintegrating gala. The temporary paralysis that had held the remaining investors in check completely shattered. The grand ballroom devolved into absolute terrifying anarchy. A group of four powerful real estate developers, led by a furiously red-faced Richard Vance, aggressively bypassed the stage stairs and cornered Harrison against the heavy velvet curtains. They were not asking for their money anymore. They were aggressively threatening immediate severe police action. Vance was practically spitting in my brother's face, explicitly demanding that the event security lock the ballroom doors until local law enforcement arrived to process the massive wire fraud. Harrison was backed entirely into the heavy fabric, weeping openly, his hands covering his face in a pathetic attempt to hide from the very people he had confidently tried to swindle just 10 minutes ago. Down on the main floor, the absolute reality of the situation finally crashed into Naomi. The complete, horrifying realization that she was legally married to a man who was not only entirely bankrupt, but actively facing decades in a federal penitentiary broke through her meticulously crafted socialite facade. She stood up from the overturned table, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the clasp on her stolen designer clutch. She did not even bother to look at Catherine or Thomas. She marched directly toward the stage, her high heels snapping aggressively against the pristine marble. She reached the edge of the risers, looked directly up at Harrison, cowering behind the furious investors, and let out a raw, guttural scream of absolute fury. "You completely ruined my life!" she shrieked, the sound cutting sharply through the chaotic noise of the room. She violently yanked the massive, custom diamond engagement ring off her left hand. She did not hand it gently back to him. She threw it with all her physical strength directly at his face, the heavy platinum band striking him sharply in the cheek before bouncing away into the shadows of the stage. Without waiting for a single response, she turned on her heel and stormed fiercely out of the grand ballroom, abandoning her fraudulent marriage and her fake tech empire in a matter of seconds. At the front table, Catherine had completely given up. She collapsed heavily into a velvet dining chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. The wealthy, influential country club wives she had ruthlessly courted all week were actively walking away from her casting, disgusted, entirely unsympathetic glances over their shoulders. Her highly prized social standing was completely vanishing in real time, burning to the absolute ground right in front of her eyes. She was utterly alone, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her own blinding arrogance. I did not feel the need to say another word. The flawless execution of the counterstrike was complete. I smoothly bypassed the screaming investors, stepped gracefully off the side of the stage, and walked straight down the center aisle. I pushed open the heavy brass exit doors and walked out into the cool, quiet night, leaving my family entirely trapped in the absolute ruins of their own making, and I never once looked back. The heavy brass doors sealed shut behind me, instantly cutting off the sounds of the chaotic implosion. I stood alone on the quiet street, inhaling the sharp, freezing night air. It was the absolute cleanest breath I had taken in 33 years.